This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, I will be talking with Jacob King. He's a YouTuber with a channel called The Last Sitcom. I'll be talking to him about YouTube, his own channel, and what he wants to do in the future. My guest is Jacob King. He runs The Last Sitcom, a YouTube channel that deals with an assortment of things from science, psychology, pop culture, and I recently it came up on one of my feeds, and I started watching some of the videos. The first one I watched was the one that Work by Die: How Consumerism Brainwashed America, which is I thought was a real gem, a nugget that in 6 minutes condensed what most YouTubers would probably use an hour to talk about. But anyway, before we get too carried away with my own voice, Jacob, welcome. And if you could give a little background about who you are, a little bit about your site, why you started it, etc.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for having me on. And yeah, so for me, fundamentally, I was a writer, and I worked as a ghostwriter for a number of years. I had a number of stories published, and I started in film school. I left film school after one semester, and I became more and more interested in literature. And it was really like I really discovered the modernists in depth at that point. And At some point during this interview, I'd like to talk to you about T.S. Eliot, because I've read that you're not a big Eliot fan. And so maybe we can go back and forth on that. But to me, writers like Eliot or like Pound, especially, like to see the way that they could create these incredibly dense texts that someone could study, for years, seemed a lot more complicated and interesting and rich than even some of the best films, at least to me. And so like I sort of went in, like I became more interested in being a great writer. And I studied religion in grad school. I taught it for a little while at a community college because I thought like I'll get a better education doing that than studying creative writing. Worked as a ghostwriter, but I feel like literature right now, or like the way publishing works right now, feels very decadent to me for a lot of reasons. And we can go into that at some point. But I started to feel like YouTube or online video was this like really profound new medium
Mm.
to communicate things. Like it's different from television, and it's different from film. And Marshall McLuhan, who's a big influence on me, talked about how every new medium, actually the content of the old medium is the new medium, right? So
Yeah.
the content of cinema is theater, the content of television is cinema, and the content of the YouTube video is television in many ways, right? But it's also video games. And video games are complicated. We can talk about those a little bit too. But yeah, so like it's interesting to me that YouTube is this like way of sort of digesting all of these other old media. And so the goal really was to create a channel that talked about big ideas. And the first video you saw, the how consumerism brainwashes culture. It's funny. A lot of YouTube creators talk about how they'll work for months on a video and it'll get 200 views, and then they'll do like a totally low effort video,
Yeah.
and it'll explode. And that one didn't take me very long. It was based, there's this book I read a long time, or a few months ago by Stuart Ewan called Captains of Consciousness, which is a great little history of advertising, the early part of the 20th century. And like the reason, like, so I just made it almost like as a throwaway,
Mm.
and it got exponentially more views than anything I've ever done.
Yeah.
It's like over 100,000 at this point. My channel blew up from 300 subscribers to like I think I'm at 2,000 as of
Yeah.
today, from that single video, right? And so it's like I had the chance to monetize, but if you'll probably notice that like a bunch of my older videos actually I deleted because I couldn't monetize because they said I was spreading harmful content, which I am not. I don't think. But it's interesting because like a lot of those early videos were actually narratives, right? Like I was trying to write these little short stories,
Mhm.
and some of the characters said and did things that were unsavory, right? And so I think YouTube might have thought that I was advocating for certain behaviors that I am not, because they're from the perspective of narrators. Which those things got no views at all because I didn't understand how YouTube worked or what it was for. And so it's sort of been a process of figuring that out. But I hope that's not too much of a long-winded way of
No,
sort of
that's
answering
fine.
your question.
Yeah, it's interesting because ever since the Hamas Israel thing, I've been on Quora, the website Quora, and I see some of the most racist cartoons against the Palestinians. And whether to me, I don't want to get sidetracked by the whole thing. I mean, there's enough blame to go around on both sides, but that these websites, these social media, are totally irresponsible. Facebook on the is another one. For the last couple of months, on my feed when I'll be at lunch at work or on a break, and I'll look on something Facebook, watch what little video that comes up or a news thing in my feed, and then we'll say, it might be scorpion takes on praying mantis, and they'll have these two insects fight, or they'll have otter takes on something else, and they'll put these animals together in these fights, and I'm like, Michael Vick, if you remember, the football player, got in big trouble 15 years ago, and here they are violating their own standards, and I keep reporting them, and they say it doesn't violate our standards, and it's like such crap. Years ago, 6-7 years ago, on Twitter, during when the Jewish temple was bombed in Pittsburgh, was it? That blonde twat that Ann Coulter was basically clapping and cheering about it, and I called her a cunt on her feed. I got kicked off of Twitter, but she's cheering on the deaths of people in their own place of worship, but Ann Coulter gets what, 500, who knows how many, 5 million fans or something. I'm a nobody by comparison, so she basically can say whatever she wants, and it's the same thing with YouTube. So let me ask you about the lowest common denominator sort of trap that YouTube falls into, because since you talked about monetizing, I know, there's so many garbage websites. I'm not even talking about the stuff that just recycles the same stuff. You'll see a little girl putting on lipstick, giving makeup advice, 25 million views in 2 weeks or something. And the algorithm, from what I've heard from people who know far more about it than I do, encourages this lowest common denominator thing. So as presumably, if your channel gets more popular, do you want to sort of ride the wave of the algorithm, or are you looking to just find your own niche?
So it's what you're saying, I think, is really interesting, because I think that you've got a point, and there is, like, for me, for a long time, I wondered, like, have I been shadow banned, or like what's going on, because I have expressed some opinions that might seem to be controversial, but what I wonder about, right? Because I've gotten 2 videos just nuked from my platform. One was about Pizzagate, where I wasn't saying that I believed in Pizzagate at all.
I don't know. That was something to do with gaming, wasn't it?
No, it's like a QAnon thing, right? Okay. Like it's like a right, it's identified as like a right-wing conspiracy theory.
I got my gates mixed up. I know there was some kind of gate.
Yeah, there's Gamergate too. I don't know very much about that, but I only play single player games, so I'm like, I'm like very isolated. I don't talk to other people on video game and stuff. So that actually got removed from the channel, so it got removed one time, and I protested and I said, like, listen, I'm not saying this is true, right? I'm not saying it's a real thing. I'm saying that I disagree with this. But then at the end, I was like, but at the same time, like, look at what happened with Jeffrey Epstein, right? Like, he was protected. This, like, so these people, like, there is a grain of truth in what they're saying, clearly. But I'm not saying that what they believe is true. And I actually, like, I explicitly said this. And like 2 or 3 times, it got kicked off the platform. I protested, and then at one point, they just sent me an email saying your video has been removed for, quote, bullying and harassment. And you have a permanent strike on your account, which is a warning, right? So it's like and I can actually, now I'm able to, like, get it hopefully off by January, but it was very weird because, like, I made a video saying this wasn't true, and hopefully this doesn't get your channel in trouble, like, even mentioning it, right? Like, I'm explicitly saying this is not true, but I got kicked off, and then I made this my magnum opus in terms of YouTube videos. You can still see it on Rumble. I made this documentary about the CERN ritual hoax at CERN, my video was removed, and it said it's because you were spreading, like, harmful medical misinformation about COVID. I didn't mention COVID in the video, never mentioned the vaccine, never mentioned anything like that. The video was about a conspiracy theory that arose about, this supposed hoax human sacrifice that happened at CERN. which again I show explicitly like that sacrifice was a hoax, but then I go into, because of my background in religion, I show sort of these like I make these connections between ceremonial magic, and a lot of modern science. Like that's really what the video is about. Again, it has nothing to do with medicine, has nothing to do with any vaccine at all. And yet my video was removed without, and the second I protested it, like literally within minutes, I got an email back saying like, sorry, no dice, you're done. The video's off. And that didn't count as a strike, but it's very strange the way that YouTube can boot some videos for seemingly no reason.
I started this interview series in December of 2014, but less than a year into it, I had, well, maybe a year and a half, I had done a video about some films that were in public domain that were film noirish, and one of them was actually a Western noir, Yellow Sky, a really terrific movie if you ever get a chance to watch it. It was on YouTube and it said public domain, thing. So I downloaded. I edited like 2 or 3 clips from it to show in the show, because I was trying to stretch my own meager skills there to then insert it in when we were talking about it with my guest. My video gets a strike because Yellow Sky, some idiot in Germany claimed that they own the rights to it. I'm like, I said, I put in my protest, I said, here is the original link. You guys say that the film is public domain. It's listed in the public domain of Wikipedia stuff, in public domain rules. It was never renewed. How can you do that? No, but I've got a permanent strike. So I said, fuck it. I'm not even going to bother doing that. One time you want to give me a strike, I don't care. That's why I do these interviews that, no one can say that my talk to you is violating copyright. But some neo-Nazi incel in his basement who wanted to fuck with someone basically did that. But so
wait, so they didn't reinstate your? Usually, almost always when I do a copyright protest, they let me, because I'm always using it fair use, right? Because you probably noticed like a ton of my videos use clips, right? Like I used the clip from They Live recently. And in the video before the one that blew up, I used a clip from like Joe Rogan's stand-up, and both times they're like, "This is copyrighted material," and then I sent the thing in, and they're like, "Okay, no, never mind, it's fair use." They didn't show it as fair use.
Who knows? They may have done it, but that's like 350 interviews ago, 7-8 years ago, and so I don't really give a damn, because I'm less ambitious than someone like you in terms of the video making process. To me, it's just a way to chime in and stuff and have a body of actual conversations that in 500 years, if we're still around, people can say, they were dumb fucks back then, but there was occasionally people who could talk intelligently. Let me talk about that film, because I did watch, in your initial reply to me, you had a link to your trailer, and I think there was another one to the actual film. I didn't watch the film, but I watched the trailer, and it reminded me of like about 6-7 years ago, there was a whole host of sort of mini 8-10 minute horror films, and with like the jump cuts, and usually there's a clown following someone across the street, and of course the girl turns around and the clown is right over, fade to black kind of thing. Your film was you were doing something with it looked like it was almost pseudo-apocalyptic film or something. What if you want to just give a brief run about what that's about, and are you still is that like the first film that you're going to look to try to make more films in that vein, or?
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, I'm. It's interesting because like I got pulled away from film for a long time to be a writer, but I got pulled back in the last couple of years, and I ended up making this, writing and directing this movie called Caviar, and it's the reception's been really interesting because a lot of people think it's like this right-wing movie, and I don't really identify with the right or the left. I mean, I'm a Catholic convert, and we can talk about that at some point, but it's like my worldview is Catholic, right? Which is like, and so my idea is like
small C Catholic or capital R Catholic.
Roman Catholic.
Oh, Roman Catholic. Okay.
Yeah. And like my view is like let's stop murdering people all over the world. Like that's my politics, right? Like any domestic stuff or whatever. It's like my main thing is like let's stop what we did in Libya. Let's not do that. What we did in Iraq. Let's not do that, right? And that's not like really a partisan question, you know. It's like a let's stop killing people question. But so what I became very interested in deepfake technology, right? And for viewers that don't know what that is, it's like I could film you and I could run you through a computer and turn you into Donald Trump or Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton or anybody, right? And so I thought that it would be really funny. And this was like in
Or you could have me like gang banging midget prostitutes or something.
That's right. That's right. But so you can porn is often what deepfakes are used for, unfortunately. But so I thought it was really funny. And deepfakes are actually have been a theme on my, like if you go to my website, I mention it a lot. Because I think that there's going to be like an epistemological crisis, like where we're not going to be able to know anything anymore. Yeah. Because, you know, if you tell me like, you know, John Kennedy was assassinated, I can say, you know, like I wasn't born in the 60s, right? Like I was born in 1987. So I can look at you and I can say, hey, that's not true. I don't believe you. And then you can say, okay, well, here's this Zapruder film to prove that Kennedy was assassinated. But then at this point, like I know enough how on my laptop, I can change the Zapruder film and make it, I don't know, Bill Cosby that gets shot or anybody, right? Like I can do that. And so at this point, very soon, video is no longer going to be a reliable way to verify it.
It's the same thing, and I want to talk about it when we talk about the video that you did on the UAP. A year and a half or so ago, I talked with some people who were talking about the photographs, and they were saying the people that I talked to were saying you're asking the wrong people. People who fly airplanes, especially fighter airplanes, are not qualified to make judgments on it. Ask a photographer, because if you look at all those weird shapes, they said that's the aperture on cameras, and you can see all of these people think, oh, you notice how whenever it turns left or right, the thing turns with it. That's because it's the aperture of the camera that's there. And anyway, but let's just talk about some of the videos here. And
can I say one more thing about Caviar really quick? Sorry. So what's been interesting, right? Like our reviews on Rotten Tomatoes, like both critics really liked it, but a lot of critics hated it, and they saw like in 2019, I was hired to write a screenplay based on a novel I'd written, and there was such a culture of fear everywhere that like you just weren't allowed to say certain things, and so I have this very ornery impulse as an artist where it's like I hate that. I hate it when we're told like you're not allowed to say something. So I decided to make a movie that had Hillary Clinton and Anthony Fauci and like George W. Bush and all of these people in it, part of a gigantic satanic UFO conspiracy. And I didn't do it because I believe that's necessarily true. I did it because I thought it was really funny. And I did it because I hate American war crimes. And it's like, to me, like the thing is like even okay, let's say none of the conspiracy theories whatsoever are true. Like what was explicitly done in Iraq, what was explicitly done in under Bush, and what was explicitly done in Libya under Obama and Clinton is worse than any conspiracy theory that anybody's talking about, right? Like it's a matter of record. The hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people that are dead, right? Like this is a horrific thing, and so like I did it in like, to me, I think that art needs to be more punk rock in a sense. And I think that we really do have like a culture of cowardice right now. And I think that becomes something that creates a kind of cultural decadence. You yourself have mentioned, I saw in two different videos where you said like art is sort of the apex of communication. I'm getting your language wrong here, but Pound said something similar, right? Where he said like that literature is the height of language and poetry is the height of literature. And when a culture's poetry decays, the culture itself decays. And the fact that we're not really able, like if someone makes a work of art that people find upsetting or challenging at this point, I feel like there's not an environment for that right now. And I find that like deeply shameful, but also I think it may turn into a real danger for our culture. And so I'm Caviar is an attempt to push against that. Well as is my channel.
Yeah, well, certainly, I agree with that. I mean, I have a 4-book thing called the New York Quartet, which is basically on this fictional mafia family, the Fifth and a Half family of New York, and the characters are set in the 19. It's basically the focus of all four books is the 60s and 70s. And guess what? These gangsters talk about raping cunts and women and whatnot. This is how I grew up in a very Goodfellas environment. I'm not Italian. I wasn't ever involved in anything explicitly with them, but I grew up there. I worked at things that were run by mobs, but I was never involved in any of that stuff. And guess what they called black people? They didn't call them Negroes. And if they want to,
that's very unfortunate.
Yeah, and it's like that's not me approving of it, but that's what it is. And if you're going to do something culturally, historically, with some accuracy, you have to do that. Same thing. Like, and I've said this before. If President Eisenhower was known to have had an affair, the difference between a biography, an autobiography, and a memoir is this: in a biography, you have someone outside writing about Ike's life, and if the fact is known, a historian of any value is going to talk about that affair. An autobiography, if Ike wrote it himself, he can choose to eliminate that, because he'll say, well, it's personal, whatnot. Now, if there's a memoir is the most nebulous of all of them, because you can change names and places and combine characters and whatnot. It's it's in a middle ground between fiction and biography, and a lot of people don't get that. But let's go through a handful of some of your videos, and I'll start with the from the latest one going backward. The one you just uploaded a day or two ago, the overpopulation lie. It's interesting because I have been watching, it's been coming in my feed, this constant bullshit about the depopulation crisis, that if we go from 8 billion people down to 5 billion in the next 100 years, that's going to be a bad thing. Well, it's only going to be a bad thing if we still want to live like we're living today and have all of the wealth squandered up in a few rich white males who believe that in this great replacement theory that Elon Musk has. That's the only way it's going to be bad, because you remove if you have 2 billion less people, it's going to be a big imprint. I mean, on a carbon or a lack of a carbon footprint. We had when I was born in 1965, I think there was something like 2.5 billion people on the planet. We did just fine, and you can't predict out to the end of the century, because guess what? There's going to be another COVID-like event, probably even worse. It's going to kill off a lot of people, and this will likely spur people to be fucking like crazy, So what I know you're talking about Malthus here, which is the other end historically, but it seems like we've now gone to this new bullshit with people like Musk who and their fears. So if you want to comment on your video and then the ball going in the opposite direction.
So I probably have a rosier view of Musk, at least on some of that stuff, than you do, in the sense that I mean there are things he's done that I disagree with, but I think that, and there are things on Twitter that I find equally unpleasant as it was back in the day. But I feel like what's happening right now with social media and censorship is like one of the most frightening things that could have happened to our country, right? Like, I didn't vote for Trump either time, but I certainly didn't vote for Biden or for whoever ran the first time, war criminal Hillary Clinton. But what's interesting to me is like the fact that the Hunter Biden laptop, like you couldn't even post that story, that it was from like that very idea that or the fact that, for example, that Alex Jones got booted off all of these platforms. It doesn't mean that I agree with everything Alex Jones says, but it's interesting because, if you look at the beginning of the anthrax attacks in the early in the early part of the last century, right? Like right after 9/11, all of these letters with anthrax in the mail started getting sent to people. And the news, like ABC News or CNN, all these people were reporting uncritically that this anthrax actually came from a lab in Saddam Hussein's Iraq, and that was one of the excuses we used to confirm that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. We were lied into war, right? And then it turns out, like 10 years later, very quietly, it turns out that the person supposedly responsible for these anthrax attacks, like we know for a fact that they came from the United States, from the East Coast, from an American military laboratory of some sort. And as they were closing in on the guy, he killed himself conveniently, just like Epstein did. He killed himself conveniently before he could stand trial, before any sort of real discovery could be gone through, in a court. And so that the book on that is closed, and it's interesting to me because for whatever mistakes Alex Jones has made, I think he has like a lot less blood on his hands than Anderson Cooper or than Bill O'Reilly or Sean Hannity, right, or than Don Lemon. Right. And so to me, what's interesting to me, and, Musk, I think for unfair reasons, still doesn't allow Jones on his platform. But what to me is interesting about the overpopulation question, right? Like specifically on overpopulation, what I see, because almost always we're talking without sufficient information. Like I'm not a climate scientist. I'm not a sociologist. I'm not whatever the hell Paul Ehrlich claims to be as a scientist. So the question of hard data, I think it's people in general, I think, have a prejudice toward one worldview or another, and then they find the data to sort of support that. But something that I noticed just as a scholar of religion, as and certainly as a scholar of apocalyptic religion, like my one, I've had stories published, but my one academic publication is in is in the Nation of Islam and Scientology, like the sort of Louis Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam like recently adopted Scientology teaching. So like I'm very familiar with American apocalyptic religions. And to me, like the overpopulation thing, or not that global warming isn't real. I have great confidence that global warming is a real thing, but the way that it's articulated and the policies that are being imposed because of it, to me, feels very much like a modern secular apocalyptic religion. And so to me, like a lot of people like Paul Ehrlich are much closer to like a medieval apocalyptic figure like Joachim of Fiore, or like a modern evangelical like Harold Camping than they are to any real science. And so in my video I point out like that the forced sterilization of millions of people was a consequence of this. Like between a quarter and half of Native American women between 1970 and 1976 were sterilized. Right, the most odious and unforgivable racism emerges from a lot of these sorts of policies. And so
what they did with the Tuskegee tests.
Oh, absolutely. The Tuskegee experiment is another really, really good example of like the people who suffer from these sorts of things are people who are seen as undesirable, which again, like as a Roman Catholic, like this view of the dignity of the person should be paramount, and I think that there's something fundamentally anti-human. I think it's a cult of death is what we're really talking about when we talk about these overpopulation questions. I find it despicable.
Let me just ask you something too, because it seems that people are less interested in these things that have been proven, such as the Tuskegee stuff and the sterilization of quote unquote morons in this country. They're more interested in sort of these quasi-paranormal things like the Russian sleep experiment, if you know anything about that.
I don't, but I'll probably make a video on it.
Yeah, supposedly the Soviet Union sleep-deprived some of their people, and it would, how the Soviet Union was very much into this supernaturalism, and that somehow this freed the inner mind of the, if you look, I think it was called the Russian sleep experiment, but there's no proof. I don't think that this was ever a real thing. It may have been an internet meme, like, well, what is the big tall white guy that walks around from the horror figure, something man, a Slender Man. It's sort of a Russian equivalent of Slender Man kind of thing. It's quasi. Who knows if it's real or not? It sounds like fake because it gets into very H.P. Lovecraftian kind of stuff. But people want to. I'll guarantee you, more people know about that than know about the Tuskegee stuff.
Well, I think that's very interesting. I don't know about the Russian sleep experiment. I was about to do a video on remote viewing, but it was just too hard to get all the research together quickly. Like that to me is one of the biggest. Like the overpopulation video should have been done days ago. but there's an article that I was using as a source, right? Like to sort of create this narrative, and like I kept citing it. And there was this quote from Malthus that I was like, I don't think this is right. Like, I don't like Malthus, obviously, from my video, but it's like, I think this is taken out of context. And the more I looked, like every quote this person used was taken out of context. So I had to like redo all the research. You know, like I had to 86 the article and then do a bunch of reading myself, and it was like a colossal pain to do this. And the remote viewing is the same way, but it's interesting that we don't know enough about the Tuskegee Institute or the forced sterilization. Another really interesting thing, libertarians talk about this a lot, but you don't hear it. Progressivism, right? Like, it's very interesting that people still call themselves progressives, because progressivism and fascism have a very close ideological origin. And what's really interesting about because and you probably know this, but I'm sure you're aware that like a lot of like the American left and before World War II were like really liked Mussolini. Like Mussolini was seen as like not a bad dude by a lot of the American left. And what's interesting, right? My video on Benjamin, I'm not a Marxist, but there are a lot of Marxist thinkers that I think have a lot of insight. Benjamin has a really interesting way of articulating. I hope you understand the connection to the Tuskegee thing, right? Because the Tuskegee thing is like a very racist, fascist sort of way of imposing government ideas on a population because they think it's justified, right? Or the sterilization, etc. But it's interesting because the ideology of fascism, it's not like let's go back into the past, right? If you read Mussolini's manifesto about fascism, or if you read the Futurist Manifesto, which sort of articulated fascism before fascism was a thing, they called themselves futurists because they believed in the employment of technology and in the young, right? And in these ideas that broke with the past radically. And you see also progressives like Teddy Roosevelt, like Woodrow Wilson, Wilson was like the most odious racist in the history of the country, one of. Also a professor, which that says something. But
a college president as well.
Oh yeah, he was a real piece of work. But what's interesting about both of those figures is they said like we need to discard the Constitution. The Constitution is it was great for a time, but mankind itself has evolved, and we're moving into a new era, and the Constitution is a relic of a bygone time. And futurists and fascists were the same way, where Hitler and Mussolini saw themselves as the wave of the future, not as like going back to this past thing, right? This is in part why they sort of reimagined religion or disposed of it entirely, and they saw this idea of like the state as being like all human beings sort of being assimilated into the state, not in the way that Marxism did, but in a different way. Right, and Benjamin in my video, he points out that technology is that we see this is actually a product of technology, and this boom in technology in the early 20th century, that it can go one of two ways. It can go toward making life better for everybody, or it can go toward war. Right, and I think this making life better also turned into totalitarianism, like where you see in the USSR. Well, you can, right, but in terms of war, we see the application of technology for the slaughter of human beings very clearly in Mussolini's Italy, in Hitler's Germany, but also in the United States a lot of times. And
progressive the whole eugenics movement, a lot of what ended up in Nazi Germany came from America.
Exactly.
From you can trace a direct line from Andersonville to the Boer War camps in the Boer War directly to Nazi Germany. Hitler and his whole boys, they knew American history. There's a quote that may be apocryphal, but it was I forget, was it against General Grant, or maybe it was I think maybe what's his name, the guy who rampaged, Sherman might have, some post Civil War Northern general who was responsible for a lot of the massacres during the Indian War. And again, it might be apocryphal, but Hitler supposedly said, that fella, he really knew how to deal with problems. And a lot of people have speculated that the final solution came from that. But I wanted to ask too, a comment. when you talk about the American left, I'm not a big Noam Chomsky fan. To me, the guy is a genocide denialist. He denies many of the atrocities committed by Stalin, by Mao, in the killing fields. And so, what to
Oh
me,
yeah, Paul. Yeah, his
what's the
history.
difference
Pol Pot
between him and a Holocaust denier? You know?
Yeah. So okay. So Chomsky is an interesting character, and we could talk about him at
Interesting,
length.
but I find him repugnant, even though I might agree with 80% of what he says.
So that's the thing is like there are a lot of people. I think there are a lot of great thinkers that way, where I find Eliot. There's an example, right? And I think Eliot later apologized for it, but Eliot supposedly was quite an anti-Semite, like in his earlier years,
yeah.
maybe influenced by Pound, but then like later apologized for it. But you know that a lot of great artists. Malcolm Lowry, like who's a better writer than Malcolm Lowry, but at the same time, he seemed like a real prick, but I wanted to say on the Hitler, before we go to Chomsky, it's what you're saying is really interesting because Hitler openly acknowledged that American segregation and racial policy was an influence on his policies towards Jews in Nazi Germany. And another person that he was deeply influenced by, you probably know, is Henry Ford.
Yeah.
Henry Ford wrote an anti-Semitic book called The International Jew. Yeah. And Hitler gave Henry Ford a medal, like an honorary medal that I guess Ford flew to Germany to receive, and Ford never gave it back, even after the end of the war, right? So Ford was like a card, Walt Disney.
Well, Henry Ford and Charles Lindbergh were two useful operatives, if you will. Whether it's arguable whether Lindbergh really knew he was. He may have just been stupid, but Ford knew better.
You mean Ford? Yeah, I don't know very much about it. All I know is the Lindbergh baby, right? Is that the same Lindbergh?
Yeah, Charles Lindbergh. Yeah, I mean, you look up Charles Lindbergh. He flew. He was a big supporter of Nazi Germany before 1941. There have actually been alternate history sites says, what if Charles Lindbergh had ran for president against FDR in 36 or something? Would the U.S. have joined the Axis? I mean, it's nonsense. You can only stretch that so far. Okay. So I found it interesting that last clip you'll ever see video. I had no idea that Ted Turner, who's also an interesting figure, did this doomsday video, and all it is a marching band. I guess was it the Tomb of the Last Soldier or something somewhere that Arlington.
It was at CNN headquarters.
Oh, okay, and basically doing that. It's where did you even find out about that?
I can't remember. It's funny because that video, it didn't get very much traction. Okay, so the thing that I used to sort of find out whether I should make a video on a subject instead of just making videos on whatever I want is I use a software called vidIQ, where it tells you hey, this is what people are searching for. This is what people who watch your channel might be interested in. And I didn't listen to them that time because I was like, hey, a lot of people might find this interesting. But there was actually a ton of content on it already. And I cannot remember for the life of me. Maybe I saw it on Last Week Tonight because I used that clip in the video. But yeah, the Turner is an apocalyptic from what I understand to some degree. And some people say that he had something to do with the Georgia Guidestones, which also talks about maintaining a low population. Do you know what I'm talking about, the Georgia Guidestones?
No, I've heard the term, but I don't know what it means.
It's this weird monument in somewhere in Georgia, and it has all of these prescriptions for having a good society. And a lot of people think it's some dystopian Klaus Schwab New World Order agenda, that they're telling you what they're going to do before they do it. And one of them is maintain a global population under 500 million, which is a little bit eerie to say the least. But no one really knows who made them. And during the COVID era, someone vandalized or might have blown it up or something, that monument, which is pretty funny. But yeah, a lot of people say he had something to do with those Georgia Guidestones. I'm not sure where I heard.
When you mentioned that, I was thinking there's in Florida there's this property that was owned by a mysterious guy who over 30 or 40 years put up these Stonehenge big rocks, and he built apparently a Stonehenge by himself, and it's so precise that with just one finger you can push a 4-ton rock and go through it like a swinging door. It's called the Florida something stones. I forget what. I thought that's what came to mind, but it's interesting what you just said. then you, the one I saw is another one I saw is the one on the chiropractors, and I've had some back issues and stuff before. And I knew a little bit of. I think though there's a difference between chiropractors that are just about helping you bend or helping you with back issues, and then there are the people who have the chakras and the this and the that, and the 250 points on the body with the sticking the needles in and whatnot. What prompted you to make that video?
Well, so yeah, I mean, so before I did my thesis on what I did when I was studying religion, one of my initial ideas to do a thesis on was chiropractic, because I went to a chiropractor for a long time. I was a lot skinnier. I should continue to follow her dietary advice, but I remember she was doing this one thing where like she was testing to see what materials I needed, and she like put them in my hand, and she would like press down. And I looked it up, and it came from this belief that like my skin can understand what materials I want or whatever, which sounds like woo-woo nonsense. And I started to look up like what chiropractic is and who really founded it. And I discovered its origins in American spiritualism, and it seems to me like it's a 19th century version of Scientology. I think it's first principles, like philosophically. Are much closer to religious principles than scientific ones, and so that's why I wanted to. And there's another example of, as opposed to the one that got a ton of views, like that video was one of the hardest I've ever worked on a video. Like that video took me, I think, 2.5 weeks or something to edit together. Like it was excruciating to make that video, and it's got like less than 500 views. And which again, I didn't listen to vidIQ. They said don't do something about chiropractic, and I did, and nobody watched it. That algorithm question, it's interesting. Do you know who Mr. Beast is?
I work in a supermarket, and now he's got candy bars. I know he started out on YouTube.
Yeah, and he gets zillions of views. And what's interesting, he gives a lot of interviews about like what he did to be successful on YouTube. And one of the things he says that I thought was really insightful and that's helped me is he said, like, people shouldn't even be talking about the algorithm. That, like, you should substitute the word algorithm for audience. And it's like, what does your audience want to see? Because YouTube has, as I'm sure you know on your channel, like you see all these, when you go to your analytics tab, right? Like when someone has a channel, they have these, this YouTube studio, and you can see your analytics, and you can say, oh, how long was someone watching my video? When did they click off? What percentage of people? So like what number of people actually even saw my thumbnail? And then what percentage of people upon seeing my thumbnail chose to click on, right? And so the things that you need to determine, first of all, whether or not to get views is like as an audience member, right? Like how many people saw your thumbnail, chose to click on it, and then how long did they watch after they clicked? And that's what's going to determine whether or not your video gets shown to more people or not. Like that's really that's the litmus test. And I think there's real insight there, and that's what I'm trying to discover is like what was different about my consumerism video than say my overpopulation video is actually doing okay. It's only got like 120 views so far, but that's actually more than almost any other video I've gotten. By time I might change the thumbnail, but yeah, like this question of like what thumbnail makes people feel like they have to click, right? And what title makes people not want to look away. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is people need to be watching for like over half of the video or whatever, because YouTube wants you to succeed. Because if you succeed, then they sell more ad space and they keep people on the platform longer and they make more money. And so they give you all this data so that you can create content that keeps people, tied to the platform and keeps people watching ads. And so it's like, just work with them on making that possible. But
so since we digress,
I'm obviously no expert yet.
Yeah. Since we digress, let me ask you then, is your aim to be able to make money or living off of YouTube, or is this just a stepping stone and then you want to go back into film?
Well, I want to do both. I work in film right now, and it looks. Things are looking good in those terms, but also it's good to have multiple streams of income, you know, and I like doing it because it gives me um, it gives me an opportunity to learn a lot, and it gives me an opportunity to sort of articulate things that people aren't talking about as often, like the overpopulation stuff. I think people aren't. I think a lot of people don't know that history, right? They don't know the connection between overpopulation or this population control idea and eugenics. Um, and you know, there's like a direct pedigree from eugenics to these ideas of overpopulation. Like they that one grows directly from the other, and so to sort of tell people uh, things like that, I think it provides a real use for viewers, and I think hopefully my hope is that it elevates public discourse, you know. But
Yeah. One of the other videos, a short one that you did, was on the Mandela effect. I've always found that an interesting thing as to
yeah,
why that's come about, because you know, one of the biggest memes about the Mandela effect is this children's cartoon called the Berenstain Bears.
yeah,
I remember the 1980s when I was still in my 20s, so I was way too old for that. I remember thinking, shouldn't that be Berenstain Bears? And the fact that it wasn't the Berensteins, but they said the Berenstains, stuck with me. But the Mandela effect thing is, people seem to remember that it was the Berenstain Bears. But and then you get these weird things like, is this a time slippage? Is this the convergence of a parallel universe or something? That's like, no, it's just your fucking memories, you assholes. You're misremembering. And but people always do that. I mean, my wife's mother recently died, and for example, she's been finding feathers, and she thinks that these are symbolic of her mother, and people do these kinds of things. So what prompted you to just even do a short video on that?
well, it's an epistemological question, right? Because I talk about deepfakes in you know, in that video. I made a movie with deepfakes in it, and to me, I do think so. I mean, we can talk about 1984, or I mean, you know, very clearly, like there's that famous example of Stalin, you know, deleting one of his officials from his
Yeah,
photo, right?
yeah.
And I think a lot gets memory hold, and whether or not the Mandela effect people are right, I think this idea that we're very clear about the objective reality in the past versus, you know, our shoddy memory today. This idea of like how we know what we know and what actually forms the historical picture that we have and that we share, is that's a complicated, you know, dynamic between those two things. And I I don't have the same confidence probably that you do, that I'm able to remember the world as like it clearly was. Uh,
Well, I've got a
and
bad
so,
memory. It sticks out because it was just something that I, just sound wise, as someone who's written poetry and the music of words, Berenstein is much more fluid than Berenstain. So that's why that stuck in my mind. And I'm sure there are other ones. I've seen lists of thousands of supposed Mandela effect things, and I'm sure there's other ones that I'd be shaking my head over. But I did want to talk about the UFOs before we talk about some of the literature and stuff that you mentioned. So I had mentioned earlier about having done a show on UFOs and how the people, I had a UFO believer, a UFO skeptic, and a UFO debunker. So three stripes there. And the debunker and the skeptic were both fairly unanimous about that. If you asked any, competent news photographer, there's no doubt that it's just silly. This isn't like those fake UFO photos from the 1980s. There was a Swiss guy named Billy Meyer who was a famous fraud. They were terrible. Now I'm sure he could do a lot better. But oftentimes you'll see like, gleaming lights over Phoenix or whatnot. It's like you can I mean, I've seen videos just like that where people show how to do that kind of thing. So like you said, when 90% of 7-year-olds can make these videos that are convincing on a newscast, come on.
I agree with you. To some degree, it's interesting. Like I actually think one of the most articulate and challenging voices there is Joe Rogan's, where he like I think the fact that first of all you can hear his own skepticism where he says like I want to believe this so badly, and so it makes me want to be extra skeptical. And you have characters like Bob Lazar or whoever that he has on. What's interesting to me is there's this overwhelming degree of not the video stuff, because I don't really care about the video stuff. Like as you've heard me say a million times, like I don't think video is necessarily a reliable way of verifying information. But the fact that there are so many people in government, right? Like the former Prime Minister of Canada, for example, that there's so many people in government that talk about this phenomenon, and the fact that I would highly recommend to your viewers and to you a book called American Cosmic, which is by a scholar of religion at UNC Chapel Hill, and she examines sort of like UFO culture as a religious phenomenon.
Oh yeah, I am well familiar with that whole idea, and I think it is modern mythos. It's a modern religion. It was probably the first. I mean, maybe not the first if you want to talk about the 19th century Mormonism and Scientology in 1940 or whenever L. Ron Hubbard did it, but it has all the hallmarks of becoming a religion.
Yes, and I would argue that because it's a religion doesn't mean it's not true. I would argue that it might actually be more true than a lot of what we see on video. Like my movie Caviar, sort of there's a UFO thing in it, right? And there's this assertion that the aliens are in fact demons. And it's interesting that Grush talks about how these beings may well be interdimensional. And if you look at a lot of these UFO abduction stories, they have a very religious character. And if someone, I'm not an expert on this stuff, but from what I understand, there's a striking resemblance to sort of demonic phenomena as well. My feeling is that maybe there's something much more nefarious going on. And it's also interesting that, so there's this old argument that's made that, if the aliens wanted to destroy us, like they have to be nice, because if they wanted to destroy us, surely if they're here, they'd have the technology to do so in a blink, which I would agree with. But there's another side to that coin, which is if they wanted us to know of their existence, the same thing would be true. And my question is maybe that there are people who are interacting with these beings in political office, etc., which again, the book American Cosmic by a real scholar, not by some conspiracy theorist, but like she talks to these tech billionaires and to these people like movers and shakers in the world, talking about how they actually receive transmissions from these beings. The muse is a daemon, from what I understand, right? I know like the ancient Greek concept of daemon doesn't correlate directly to this idea of demon, but I do wonder if there's something like a little more of a spiritual character going on than we give it credit for.
Let me just jump in here, because I've talked about what I call the divine inspiration fallacy, and this is one of the reasons you always get these hatreds and rivalries between people in the arts, and that's because a lot of people think that there's something up there, they're going to pull inspiration down, and if I pull down a great poem, or someone pulls down a great film, or someone pulls down a great symphony, there's less up there for the other people. So they get this sense of possession about something that's actually coming from them. And as regards like the phenomena of people who have had experiences with aliens or near-death experiences, the reason that they're so similar is because they're internally generated, I think. Because if there was something outside, people, I'm sure you've read about the experiments of this professor giving a lecture about something, in-runs someone in there, that it steals his notes or something and runs out. And it all happens within 3 or 4 seconds midway between the lecture, where everyone is sort of like, oh, this guy's boring, and something happens. Then they ask all the students, and you will get, it was a woman, it was a white woman, no, it was an Arab guy, it was a Jew, he was tall, he took papers, no, he took the professor's drink, and you get all of these interpretations. When you're dealing with real physical events, human beings are terrible. This is why eyewitnesses are not enough really to convict people these days. But when it's internally and something has, for example, the whole gray phenomenon, you can go back to like The Outer Limits, a TV show from the 1960s. a few days before the Betty and Barney Hill case, this national television show on ABC, The Outer Limits, broadcast creatures that look, 95% what Barney and Betty Hill did. And this is being broadcast to millions of people in that day. And this is the kind of thing that gets into the subconscious. I, for example, have had a number of what someone would have termed paranormal or psi or supernatural experiences. But as I grew up, I realized these were actually parts of my own creativity coming out when I was young, before I had the means to rein them in. Near-death experiences, going towards the light, seeing, people in your past, seeing these angels. Well, that happens with a lot of hallucinogenic drugs, and the brain produces these very types of or similar type drugs when you're in that near-death state. So, of course, you're going to have these experiences, except if you're someone creative. My near-death experience wasn't anything like the going to the light. It was much more like a bad Philip K. Dick story, which is most of his stuff. But so when we have these kinds of things talking about these sort of psi or supernatural phenomena, I think most of them are internally generated. Now, with UFOs, I certainly believe the government would act just as its biggest detractors talk about it if we had captured, say, a UFO in 47 in Roswell or Corona or in any of the other half a dozen major cases. But when I look at the stuff like the gray aliens, or I don't know how familiar you're with UFO law, there was Antonio Villas-Boas in Brazil, a guy who claimed to have sex with a gorgeous alien with red pubic hair who barked like a wolf and bit his chin. This is along with the Betty and Barney Hill case.
Did she call him the next day, or was it just like a one?
Apparently, it was a one-off. But
okay.
but a lot of them, I think. I'm not a big fan of Freud, and I'm not really a big fan of Jung. But I think there is something to the idea when we talk about. There's so much obvious sexual symbolism in alien abductions. But I'm getting off the topic. But do you have any comment?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of obvious sexual symbolism in demonic encounters too.
Yeah.
And
hags.
Absolutely.
What are the male and female?
The incubus, succubus,
incubi and succubi.
Right, but so keep in mind, like, the very idea of temptation. Are you familiar with the concept of a phantasm? It's in Aristotelian epistemology, and Aquinas picks it up, and a lot of like the ceremonial magicians like Giordano Bruno or Marsilio Ficino, people like that mention it as well. Are you familiar with this idea of a phantasm?
I wasn't aware of the depth that you just talked about. I know the term phantasm in a dictionary sense, but no, go on.
So what I'm going to do the best I can. I'm a little spotty on Aristotelian philosophy, but so from what I understand, a phantasm is this mental image, right? So the phenomenon comes in through your eyes. And then it's kept inside your mind as this mental image that corresponds to what you've seen. And this sort of light image is what the higher mind takes up and is able to categorize, like, the microphone I'm looking at is black and it has, like a fuzzy thing on top, and there's like I can categorize and say, oh, okay, it's the color black. And so then it's a black thing, and it correlates all these categories. I'm able to understand it by labeling it and all these things. It's a microphone, right? It's part of this universal category microphone, this particular thing. So like I'm able to recognize it. Like this image comes in from the outside, and then I'm able to sort of pick pieces apart from it and abstract in order to understand. Now, the reason I mention this is that phantasms don't always have to come from like visible phenomena. They can be sent. They can be sent by a magician, but they can also be sent by a demon or by a celestial influence, right? This is very old stuff, and it's stuff that you can look up. You can see this sort of thing, and it's very interesting, this idea that like perhaps a celestial influence can be could be responsible for planting lustful thoughts inside of someone's head, etc. The Betty and Barney Hill thing, again, like I don't know enough about them, but like their eyewitness testimony. Like, let's just say it didn't happen, right? And I'm not willing to say that. I don't know enough about them. And certainly they sacrificed a great deal for what they went through. If it was, I don't know. I don't know enough about Betty and Barney Hill, but someone like that Prime Minister of Canada, someone like David Grush, at great personal expense, coming out and saying like, not that I witnessed an alien, but that I was part of a bureaucracy that was working to hide these things coming out. That to me is a lot more reliable and startling testimony, right? All these Navy pilots, and all these videos that get released. The fact that the government itself says, calls them UAPs and says, okay, they're real. We don't know what they are, and again, maybe they're lying about that. Maybe it's some sort of technology. I'm not at all discounting any of that. But what I'm saying is like, we can discard the eyewitness testimony as a means of verification of whether or not the phenomenon is real, in that sense. But what we can do in a lot of that eyewitness testimony is we can pick it apart and we can say like, well, what's really going on here? And does this correlate to, other people's experiences that don't use the term UFO, or that might have experienced things, before the dawn of this way of it? Because what's really interesting is, as our world has become more secular and more material, I think we've found different ways of talking about the same things that we've always been experiencing. And so, yeah, I'm very, if it's real, I'm very reluctant to say that it's a good thing. As you probably noticed in my video, I end with my, that famous prayer to Saint Michael, because I find it rather frightening. But it's a really old video, so I don't actually remember. I think I go through like Lou Elizondo and stuff, which is, he's sort of old news. I don't remember what happened with him.
Well, there's a I don't know what we'd call it, a theory within psychology regarding why people join gangs or why people join outre groups. And the theory is, I think, a very sound one, is that the heckling and the ridicule that person for joining that group will get from the bulk of society is far outweighed by the positive support within society. This is why kids join gangs. They have de facto families. They have de facto hierarchies that they can fit into. I was in a gang as a kid, and I know this to be true. Not only did I get a little bit more approval, but I also got laid a lot more than I would have if I hadn't been in a gang. And so applying that to when people say, well, they why would someone claim they saw a UFO if they were going to be ridiculed? Why would someone say that Jesus came to them in a vision when well, those things I think apply quite readily there. You're always going to have a lot of fundamentalist Christians who are going to say, oh, Jesus came to you when you needed him most, or the feathers thing with my wife, and things like that. So I don't really buy that's enough to say that because someone says that they were raped by a succubi, or that they were abducted by, or that they saw Bigfoot walking along. There's always going to, I think, be a lot within the smaller in group, a lot more support than in the out group. So I don't know. What do you have any idea or comment about?
Oh, I agree almost entirely with what you're saying there, and I think there's a lot of I guess what you would call like clout, the kids would say, in saying that you had some sort of religious or UFO whatever experience. That's indisputably the case. And so almost all, like post Betty and Barney Hill, almost all these like UFO experiencers, including Lazar, like I would look at, again, it's like that sort of thing. It's interesting to listen to, and some of it may be true, but that's not where I would go in terms of verifying whether this information is real, right? Like now, David Grush could be a useful idiot. He could be lying on the part of the government. There are all kinds of things that he could be doing, but I think it's hard to argue that this guy, again, at like great risk to his career, like this guy's going to be laughed at, and he's going to be sort of spit on by his colleagues for coming out and doing this sort of thing. Like David Grush is I think a different category. Now, Betty and Barney Hill also, I really don't know very much about them, but like from what I understand, they were like one of the very first abductees. Mm-hmm. And so again, they could be lying. It could be a cloud thing. but it's interesting, like, as you know, a couple that already faced a lot of discrimination because they were, you know, an interracial couple, you know, you know, pre civil rights, I think, actually, if I'm not mistaken. Like, I think they were married in the 50s,
Yeah.
right? And so it's like these people who probably don't want a ton of national attention on them because they are already subject to this horrific bigotry to begin with. You know, that Betty and Bar, like, so they're an interesting case. Again, I don't know a ton about them, but it's like I don't know. I don't know enough about Betty or Barney to say that that they're lying or telling the truth. But to me, David Grush or like some of the more official folks that have come out and talked about it, because they have, and you know, because of those Navy videos, and because, you know, the Army could have said, "Oh, it's just our camera" or whatever doing it. Like, why would the Army come out and or the Pentagon come out and acknowledge the reality of this phenomenon if if there wasn't at least something to it? And so I think keeping an open mind on that question is an important one. But
well, yeah, I certainly have an open mind about it, but the stuff that they have put up there, I mean, it's piss poor evidence. I'll give you another example, and just to go back, I mentioned that I had a near-death experience. I drowned in a lake when I was 6 years old. I was involved years later with a woman who also claimed to have a near-death experience, and I caught her right in the act of confabulation, because she was claiming at one point that as she floated up out of her body, she could see a relative of hers buying something to eat. And as she was telling me this, as we were getting to know each other, within an hour she told the same tale, but had three different things that the relative was supposedly buying. And I mentioned this, and I said, well, first you said it was A, then you said it was B, then you said it was C. And I said, you know, I mean, I'm not trying to say that you didn't have this experience, but within less than 45 minutes or so, you've changed your story, or you've offered three different stories. That's, you know, that doesn't say much. Of course, now things didn't go well between us overall, but a lot of times this kind of thing happens. I did a show, one of these shows, where I was interviewing two women about life after death, one pro, one con. The pro woman said that she had out-of-body experiences. This came out of nowhere, not just near death. She said she went far beyond Pluto. Now, this was just a year or two after the photos of Pluto came back in the mid-teens, and I said, well, did it ever occur to you to maybe take a good look at Pluto as you flew by and say, oh, there's this heart-shaped geological formation there. If you had done that and wrote that down, that would be not definitive proof, but this would at least get your name in the history books there. And it didn't even occur to her. Going back to what I said about the woman I was involved in, they have done tests, for example, in operating rooms, some operating rooms where they have studied this stuff, and they put something on the top of a shelf in the far corner, so that when someone's coming out, they should be able to see what they wrote on this sheet of paper or something. No person who's ever had a near-death experience in an operating room has ever been able to do that, which again highly suggests that it's internal. Now, I'm open to the proof, but you know, going back to UFOs, and you mentioned Lazar and all the people from Roswell, 75 years, if you want to look at 1947 as the modern era of UFOs, I don't believe that thousands of people could have kept this biggest secret. It seems far more likely to me that this is a disinformation campaign, first, you know, with Russia and China, then with the war on terror, and now back to China and again. This, you know, it's very convenient to throw at these bones when you're really doing something probably, far more nasty as a government entity. Who the hell knows what kind of weapons of mass destruction we could be cooking up out in the Great Basin, you know?
I think you've got a lot of. I agree almost entirely with what you're saying. By the way, your friend who saw Pluto would be the only person that ever did anything interesting about Pluto. I don't understand why we sent a satellite there. It's like, to me, it's the most boring of all celestial phenomena. Like, go to Uranus or Neptune or Jupiter. Like, those places are fascinating. Like, who gives a rip? Pluto is smaller than the moon, and there's nothing going on there. And I'm glad it's not a planet. Screw Pluto. I'm not. I'm like very firmly anti Pluto. But that would be interesting.
I'd rather they screw Goofy and keep Pluto, but
Yeah. But so the thing for me, like I agree. So I don't, like I was pointing out, I don't think eyewitness testimony. I don't think that's where we should look at any of this, because it could very well be that your friend had an out of body experience.
well, it wasn't a friend; it was a woman I'd never met. But
Oh, okay, but anybody, right?
yeah.
Like it could very well be that these are legitimate, etc. But that in what happens to someone internally is not a good record. What I'm saying is that the people in governments across the world that are coming out, that's what to me is interesting, right? Like that to me is, that's what I think demands our attention and our questions, and it could be what you would call a disinformation campaign. But I also think it's possible. That something much nastier is happening with UFOs than we think. And you know, I'm on. Yeah, let's just put it that way. I think I think it could be. You, I think, I don't think that the use of magic in like a dirty sense, right? Like black magic, ceremonial magic, etc. I don't think that that's dead at all. And I think that people might be interested in communicating with certain entities that don't have our best intentions in mind. And I think there might be something there regarding UFOs, but that's, you'll have to see Caviar, and you'll be able to tell me, because that's, I mean, that's really what it's about, right? It's like a giant UFO conspiracy.
So Jacob, earlier on, before we got talking about conspiracies and all kinds of stuff, from government stuff to Pluto, you had mentioned you wanted to talk a little bit about some. Did you mention some videos that I had done, and T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound?
Yeah, well,
go ahead.
I read on Wikipedia that you don't like T.S. Eliot, and tell me why. I'm interested to know.
Well, first off, I don't use terms like and dislike in terms of the literature. It's good or bad when I art, and this is always just a pet peeve. As for T.S. Eliot, the person, anything I've ever read is he was an anti-Semite, a bigot, an asshole. But I mean, he wasn't as bad as Ted Hughes. So, you know, Sylvia Plath's husband. Okay, you don't know who that is. Yeah, he's considered the resident psychopath of poetry, modern English poetry. But as far as T.S. Eliot, his plays suck. I mean, his plays are just bad, poorly plotting melodramas. He's only did 2 or 3 of them, I think. I find his criticism to be, you know, occasionally interesting. You know, Pound is a much more interesting, a far, I think, greater figure. But Eliot has maybe 4 or 5 poems, and then he falls off a cliff, and it's shit. And he only wrote or published maybe 80 or 100 poems. You know, I have a friend of mine who's going to be putting out a book of poems by another dead friend of mine that I edited. And he was a mentally ill man who died last year. But he created a whole poetry form. I don't want to get sidetracked, but to me, Eliot is one of the most overrated figures, because The Wasteland itself has some moments here or there, but if you actually were to look at all the notes and go where it's going, it's dull. It's not particularly musical, and it's not particularly interesting. Probably his best poem is Hollow Men, or no, probably if you want to consider the 4 quartets as a single poem, that's obviously his magnum opus. Even though The Wasteland is more famous, the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, the Hollow Men, and so that's basically about it. So depending on how you want to look at the
Ash Wednesday too.
Ash Wednesday is another good poem. But then once you get to the one where, you know, he's making fun of other, you know, the high pitched voice of Mr. Eliot or whatever, there's so many, and a handful, 4 or 5 of the children's poems in his Book of Cats, which became later the musical Cats,
which is the worst musical ever. Like.
Yeah. Well, it's got a couple of songs, and you could argue about that. I mean, I don't think the Spider-Man musical is going to be remembered in 50 years.
No, Wait, can I just say really quickly? Because okay, do you remember speaking of UFOs, right? Like Glamour Cat gets taken up in a UFO at the end, and I remember going into Cats thinking like, what's the big deal? Like I'm really excited to see this thing because this was before I realized how crummy musicals were generally. But to me, Andrew Lloyd Webber I think is hilarious. Like because he genuinely comes across as someone that has been like his work. Someone said of Oasis's album "Be Here Now," which I think is underrated. They said it was like cocaine set to music, and to me, Cats and especially Starlight Express are like cocaine set to music. Right? Starlight Express is about a bunch of trains, right? And all the actors have like trains on their head, and they roller skate around the ring, and they sing, and they like fight each other and stuff. And it's like we came up with this idea, and Cats is like totally structureless, right? It's like there's this cat and that cat and this cat, and there's like no story, and they're all just like telling their weird like it's one episode after another until Glamour Cat gets taken up in the UFO, and I was like, I don't know, I found it to be one of the most baffling, trippy things I'd ever seen, but I don't mean to.
But getting back to the Eliot's poems is that he has arguably 5, 6, 7 great poems, and then it falls off a cliff. And if you look, and he has a 40 or 50-year artistic career, that's not a whole hell of a lot to rest your hat on. Yes, they were influential in their day, and there's a historical importance to it, but there's a far bigger historical importance to Walt Whitman, and his stuff is still relevant today, not only in terms of nature, but human nature, the ecology, his Civil War poems still resonate. If you look at the images from again the Arabs and the Israelis going at it, or the Syrian Civil War, Eliot, Pound has a little bit more. He was more daring. Some of his early cantos before he just lost his mind, if he did lose his mind actually, are better. Some of his translations from both the Chinese and from the Middle Ages here in Europe are more daring. And plus, he was a far more fertile figure in standing up for others who were totally different. I mean, Pound would talk about Eliot's poetry and then Robert Frost's poetry in the same voice. Marianne Moore, another one. I don't know if any of these names resonate with you, but so he was, despite his ending up in the asylum and some of his more noxious political views, he was a better poet, and he was a more small c Catholic poet in that he stood up for people in the arts. This is one of the things that's missing in the modern arts. This is one of the reasons that I rail so much about stuff. It wouldn't matter to me if Joseph Goebbels or Mengele was a great sonneteer and wrote 2 or 3 great books of sonnets. I'd say, well, yeah, he was a cocksucking son of a bitch, and I'll probably have to remove that, but he could write sonnets. I mean, they're 2 different domains of human, the way we can humanize each other.
I would imagine that Goebbels probably would write some terrifying sonnets and miserable ones. But it's interesting. Okay, so what you're saying about Eliot, I'm not that familiar with his plays, or I'm not familiar with his plays, I should say. I do think The Wasteland is like dazzling and overwhelming and like a triumph. Honestly, I think Prufrock is as well. I would say that of Ash Wednesday. I'm not as big a fan of the Hollow Men, but it's interesting. 4 Quartets, which I don't know as well as The Wasteland or Prufrock, but 4 Quartets. I mean, it's the work of a consummate craftsman. But something that I noticed in 4 Quartets, and I've never seen anyone say this. I bet Harold Bloom does or somebody. But to me, the influence of Wallace Stevens on the 4 Quartets actually feels quite immense.
Stevens was a far better poet, and I'll tell
Stevens is extraordinary.
And if you want to read a better poem than The Wasteland, that's a lot shorter and a lot more musical, read 4 Preludes on Playthings of the Wind by Carl Sandburg, written in the same year, 1922. It came out actually a few months before. And Carl Sandburg has often been mocked But he was a great poet at his best. He was a great biographer of Lincoln. He was a great cataloger of folk songs. Carl Sandburg is one of the most important literary figures of the last 150 years, post Whitman, in American history. And he sort of patted on the head as some little folk, the way academia always does. Anyone who comes from grit and from the working class is usually spat upon. But Sandburg overall is a much more interesting figure, I think, if you ever get a chance to read some of his stuff, especially his biography of Lincoln. I think it's a 4-volume set.
I need to check him out. When you were mentioning him being mocked as a poet, to me, my favorite dig at a poet ever was when Dick Cavett said of Rod McEwen that he's America's most understood poet.
And Rod McEwen, again, he's a poet the way Jewel Kilcher, the 1990s singer, was a poet.
Right, or in the way that like Domino's is pizza,
yeah.
Right? like I mean, Rod McEwen is terrible, but yeah, okay. So Sandburg, I don't know that well, and so those poets, those
Hart Crane. If you want to read The Bridge,
I like Hart Crane.
Yeah,
I like H.D. I think is a great poet that really hasn't gotten her due in a lot of ways.
H.D. Hilda Doolittle.
Yeah. I think. I've recently discovered Holderlin, actually, who I like a lot. I think Holderlin is really remarkable.
Again, with foreigners, it all depends on the translations. I've got I've got 4 or 5 books of Boris Pasternak. There's only one that he seems great in. The rest aren't. But then there are poets that are translator proof. If you want to read a great Russian poet, Osip Mandelstam, no translator can
send me that name. I don't know it. I'd like to see. Well, so Holderlin, there's actually a really famous. Supposedly, there's like this authoritative, famous translation of Holderlin. He's a really remarkable writer, and his stuff is very oblique. I mean, speak of someone he was deeply mentally ill, and so he's a bit like Blake in that sense, where like he calls to all these figures that are very like they're sort of part of his own mythology almost. But Holderlin, I find really remarkable. I love Whitman. I think Whitman is great, but I think like thematically, The Wasteland I find very interesting. I don't know, like to me that's one of those texts that I've wrestled with my whole life, and I feel like my best work that I've ever done is this novel that took me 3 years to write that I hope to see published at some point in the future. And that whole book, I realized like I was really just doing The Wasteland thematically, like the questions that The Wasteland asks about Western civilization, I think are heartbreaking and profound. And I guess like, my worldview is very Christian. And I think that, I think The Wasteland functions as a kind of prayer, and an urgent one, that's still urgent. Like Pound says, literature is news that stays news. And I feel like The Wasteland has stayed news. And again, like Eliot, you're right. Like I think a lot of his poems are sort of uninteresting. I really don't care about his poems about cats. I have a cat. She's emotionally distant. I don't really feel that they're worth writing poems about. Though I love my cat, but she's been away. She may have taken a nap or something. Usually she hops on my computer. I'm surprised she hasn't introduced herself. But
well, here's one of the things you mentioned the Christian worldview, and that's fine. I don't mind when people say they like something because they're into it. I don't know how much you know about foreign films. For example, there's a great foreign film, great filmmaker Ingmar Bergman called Persona. If you've ever seen Persona, it's a fucking fabulous film. I've said this many times. Here it's Ingmar Bergman basically whipping out his dick, putting it on a table, and saying, "I'm Ingmar Bergman. You're not, motherfuckers. See this sausage." It's so virtuosic, but I don't like it because it is showy. It's like a glittery diamond. To give you an opposite kind of film that's also great, The Killing of a Chinese Bookie by John Cassavetes.
I love that movie.
Yeah, that's his best. It's the best gangster film ever made. It's better than anything by Scorsese.
The director's cut is not very good. If you see, it's really weird. Like his original longer cut, I don't think is nearly as good.
Oh no, I disagree. I think it's okay. The whole 15-minute or so monologue that he has with the prostitutes at the end that he's bleeding out and likely to die. I think that's the better one. But
Maybe I need to. It's been forever since I've seen it.
but,
So maybe I
but
should.
regardless of that, I resonate with the Cassavetes kinds of films. I resonate with Yasujiro Ozu if you ever watched Tokyo
Yeah.
Story. But I don't resonate with Ingmar Bergman. Maybe it's because I'm half Norwegian myself, and it's like I know these things. These the Japanese or the Greek American filmmakers, maybe their stuff resonates with me for other reasons. But as long as you're able to acknowledge that's I mean, I'm assuming you're heterosexual. You've gone out with women and you've been with a plain Jane and you start talking to her and all of a sudden she's starting to get a lot hotter. On the other hand, you might have lucked out and gotten a date with someone who could have been a supermodel, and you talk to her, and it's like, yeah, my name's Susie, and she starts getting she starts the sheen is coming off her. But as long as you recognize that we all have these biases, that's fine. But if someone is coming up to me and saying, Rod McEwen is a better poet even than T.S. Eliot, I'm going to say, what the fuck is wrong with you? That's like saying Plan 9 from Outer Space is better than 2001. You may think 2001 is boring. You may not like the whole Hal trope. You may not like the Star Baby at the end. But it's still a great work of art, even if you don't like it, or even if you don't, it doesn't resonate with you. Just in the same way, like I mentioned, the difference with what's his name, Bergman's Persona.
I haven't seen Persona, but I've seen. I like Bergman. Cries and Whispers was a big influence on me as a young person, and it's interesting what you're saying. Of the sort of like Scandinavian directors, my favorite is probably Von Trier. Honestly, and I think Breaking the Waves is a remarkable movie about faith. I think, and Thomas Vinterberg, right? Like directors, I think Refn is very interesting as well. But for me, like what you're talking about in terms of showiness, I haven't seen The Virgin Spring, but like to me, a movie that does it. Have you seen Wes Craven's first movie, Last House on the Left?
Yeah, and I know that's supposedly inspired by it. And
right, to me, Wes Craven is a director as remarkable as any of the greats. Like when Wes Craven is good, a movie like The Hills Have Eyes, or a movie like People Under the Stairs, right? Or Scream 2. Like the opening at Scream 2, I think is one of the most heartbreaking things I've ever seen. And I think like what you would call like B movie directors or genre directors, I think can do things that are bigger and ask bigger questions in more visceral ways than like the quote unquote virtuosos. And that's sort of I mean that's why a lot of my work like sort of falls into the horror camp, at least like film wise.
Well, the problem with genre anything, whether it's cowboy westerns, five and dime novels, whether it's horror films, whether it's certain types of music, is that you have to adhere to certain precepts by something. Like I was just watching a video the other night about psychedelic music, and I'm like, well, was that real? They list songs from this, and I'm like, well, that's not really psychedelic. And yeah, the Beatles had a little psychedelic stuff here in Rubber Soul or Revolver, but were they really doing psychedelia? And so when you then adhere to these precepts that are about a certain genre, you're almost always giving up the greater artistic vision. It's like people talk about political art. Well, the art has to come first. Whether or not you have a good or a bad or a noxious political opinion, the political art always has to come. The art in the political art has to come first. Otherwise, you're just making bumper stickers.
Right. Yeah. Otherwise, it becomes didactic. I mean, I think you have a good point there. I disagree with what you say about genre because I would argue that horror, especially and I mean, you're obviously well read enough to know this. Like horror, what we call horror now is tragedy, right? Tell me that Macbeth.
Well, certainly Frankenstein. Frankenstein is certainly a tragedy.
Right. So and the same, actually, like the same template and the same questions we ask in tragedy are like horror. It's just a renamed thing, And so if you see something like the original Hills Have Eyes, I think does that very well. Almost every slasher movie, I think, does that in a lot of ways as well, even the bad ones, But I mean, if you look at something like Sleepaway Camp or Friday the 13th Part 2, or like a lot of this stuff, like they deal with these gigantic spiritual questions, and I think that horror can do things that almost no genre can. And because again it's tragic, and so like it takes the audience through this process of catharsis, and like it actually explores like the deepest, most painful parts of the human experience. I think another
Well,
great example.
well, let me let me
Oh,
let me
go
go.
ahead.
Let me just. I don't think genres do that. I think works within genres do it because you can talk about horror, you can deal with it badly, and you can if you look at melodrama literally comes from the idea of a music accompanying the drama to tell you where to it's to tell you where to laugh, where to cry, or whatnot. That can be done well or not. I've watched soap operas for years. I knowing melodrama will help you when you graduate to drama, but it can be done well or it can be done bad. So, for example, people will say, "Oh, I love science fiction or whatnot." Okay, but there's bad science fiction. I wrote a science fiction novel where I took a public domain story of Philip K. Dick, a really bad story, and I used it within my story as a character that comes into the main narrative. And I made the individual story better, and the fact that the computer didn't catch that this was a story. Anyway, but the point is, you it can be done well or not, and so I don't. You can say yeah, the best horror may do what you had just said, but when you're dealing with something like the level of Plan 9 from Outer Space or the Room, uh, you know it doesn't, and it can't, because quality is the hardest thing to do. To get something to a certain level, that it transcends its genre. That's the thing. You can have the what's it Alien, the first Alien is a great film. It's great cinema. It's sci-fi. It's also a horror. And so by that little mixture brew, shaking that up of taking that horror, and if you look at like It, I think the movie It from the 1950s was the direct inspiration for Alien. Um, you know, that's showing a mediocre rendering of the same themes, but Alien does it better. That's why we remember Alien.
Yeah, oh, so I think you have a good point. It's interesting, right? Like because especially in movies, I would not put The Room as I wouldn't call it bad because I think that the worst sin a movie can commit is to be boring. And I think you could say a lot of things about The Room, but boring is not one of them.
I
You
would
know, like The
disagree. I
Room.
would disagree. I laughed my ass off at Plan 9. I even said that to my wife. I said, "This is bad, but it's not epically bad." you know.
Mhm. What? So for me, it's like I like my taste is sort of peculiar, I guess, but it's like I like a lot of movies that people would call bad, um, because I find them a lot of fun. Like Steven Seagal. Speaking of an artist who like might not be a very nice person, but makes interesting art, I think a lot of early Steven Seagal is fantastic. Like I think Above the Law is a legitimately great film. Like I think Above the Law is beautifully done, and beautifully acted, and I think it tears your heart out, and I think you really care about what's happening to those characters. But then like it moves like Under Siege 2, which is a ridiculous movie. Like Under Siege 2 is a blast. Like have you seen that one?
No, I've never seen a Steve. Bruce Lee is about the father. Oh, maybe one Chuck Norris movie. I was never big on martial arts stuff.
I almost want you to see Under Siege 1 and 2 and just like write me an email, like because you're such a thoughtful viewer, obviously, and I would be interested to hear what you think of, or actually Above the Law is real cinema, so you do Above the Law, don't do Under Siege. But so that's an example, or like um I'm trying. And there are other directors that I think I take a lot more seriously than critics do. Like I think Michael Bay is a real auteur, and I think he's hugely misunderstood. I think Michael Bay is as stylistically revolutionary as any director that's ever picked up a camera. That as any director that's ever done it. And
But
I don't
here's
love.
here's what I've often said is that you want to talk about plot, character. Character
Mhm.
is plot. If you read Moby Dick, you're not reading it for the goddamn white whale. You're reading it for the guys in the Pequod.
Yeah.
So any film that wants to succeed, and this is why so many experimental films like Stan Brakhage fail. But if you, I've ever seen the fifth, have you ever seen any experimental films like
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I've seen Stan Brakhage's stuff, some of it.
Maya Deren, for example? I did a show on Maya Deren. I think Maya Deren is so far beyond Stan Brakhage because in her 15-minute films, and she's only did I think 7 films, and there's less than 2 hours of her stuff out there. she was tapping into something deep. She wasn't always succeeding, and they're very low budget or whatnot. But she was someone who was attempting to do something, and she was developing character and I think all of her films initially were soundless. She was doing some remarkable things. Where Stan Brakhage is just doing the typical. He was. I guess he came before Warhol. You know, Warhol's infamous film where he like 11 straight hours of the Chrysler Building or something. You know, that kind of thing is like, you know, come on. But I'm sorry I interrupted you. Go ahead.
No, no. Wait, it's interesting what you're saying about character because there's. It reminded me of so Armageddon, which I saw recently, which I think is just a masterpiece and one of the best movies of the '90s. And when I saw it at first, I thought it was ludicrous, right? Like I think a lot of people do. They say, oh, this is just a popcorn movie, you know, like it's silly. And there's this question that I think it was Ben Affleck mentioned in this interview where he says, you know, I was asking Michael during the film, like, wouldn't it be a lot easier to train a bunch of NASA astronauts to drill oil instead of training a bunch of oil rig people to be astronauts? And Michael Bay is like, shut up. This is what we're doing. But what you're saying about character is very true because I think part of what makes Armageddon so moving and so interesting and such like a pop masterpiece is that you have these characters that seem like they're straight out of a Bruce Springsteen song. And if instead you had like science experts, right, and a bunch of dorks, it wouldn't tear your heart out in the same way. And like part of what's so profound about I think Michael Bay's movies is he's you know, a lot of country music does this poorly where it's like it pretends to be an everyman thing and it's not really. But I think Michael Bay has put his money where his mouth is a lot, even in ways that I disagree, where he's actually much more a fan of like the common man than he is of the elite. And you see that in Armageddon. Like that's really what Armageddon is about like the American spirit triumphing over this like apocalypse. And it's beautiful. It's like Norman Rockwell, but better than Rockwell. And and to me, like what makes Armageddon special is just like what you were saying, which is about character. Like it's about Bruce Willis and Ben Affleck and Steve Buscemi and these people that you feel like you almost know. And so I actually I agree with you a lot of times, but David Mamet has this really interesting. I'd be curious to hear what you think about this. Like David Mamet has this interesting idea where he says like there's no such thing as character. Character is action, right? It's like it's what someone does. It's plot or like whatever happens in a play. It's like a mechanism, right?
Have you ever read Samuel Beckett stuff? Samuel Beckett has a whole little novella where there's just a voice in darkness and it's crawling around. So it's totally and it goes against the whole show don't tell. I mean, not that I'm a great fan of Beckett, but no, I mean, ultimately, you're never going to hold the interest of people if you're just doing again the equivalent of Warhol. You know, oh, the sun is going down. Wait a second, another 43 seconds, it'll be below the horizon. You know. There's no character except perhaps if you want to say the Chrysler Building or the turn of the Earth or whatnot. So Mamet is interesting. He wrote some good stuff. I think he's a good example of an artist that's gotten worse over the years because he got a lot of the fame and he stopped trying. I'm not a big. I don't really. The films that he's directed, I think he's only directed 4 or 5. I think he's better as a writer than as a director. Here's something. I don't know if you've ever
Wait,
heard
can I just ask you really quick? Because I would disagree there. A couple of that I would point out. I believe he directed Oleana, and I like his adaptation. Oleana, I think, is a really interesting movie and play that actually that skirts the line between politics and art, I think, really well and successfully. Or, you know, some of his later movies, there's a movie he made called Spartan with Val Kilmer and William H. Macy that
I saw that one. But
he did a movie called Edmund with William H. Macy that's this dark comedy. Oh, I'm going to get a drink real quick. 1 second. Okay. But he did a movie called Edmund that's this dark comedy that's like really, really funny and bleak. I don't know. I do think, you know, like I'm not like the biggest Mamet fanboy in the world, but I feel like he's one of those people like the Coen brothers where he has this voice that's very reliable And I don't know. Like to me, I'm always interested in seeing something new from Mamet, but maybe that's just me. I don't know.
Yeah. Well. Anyway. So I was talking to Mamet. I'm trying to think. Was there anything else that you had mentioned regarding film that you had wanted? Or you had mentioned something about one or two of my videos that you wanted to ask about. Didn't you, early?
Well, so a question I had was so on the religion thing, right? And I'd be interested. I would be interested to know, like, have you seen Heist, by the way, the Gene Hackman movie with Mamet?
I don't think so.
He directed it, and it's another, I think, really interesting one. But you were talking about whether or not character, this question of like, is character action, right? And I don't know Beckett's novels. I like Beckett. I mean, I'm not that familiar with him, but something that was really interesting to me, an experience I had with a friend, a friend of mine who ended up like actually being quite a successful artist. Like me and him were sitting, and we watched Waiting for Godot in L.A. Like we were sitting and watching a play. I think like John Lithgow was in it or somebody. It was interesting because people were there watching it almost as if they were more interested in other people seeing that they got it, because it was like almost a laugh track. Like people laughed at every single joke. And like if you've read Waiting for Godot, it's not, I mean, there are a lot of jokes in it, but they're not like funny in that sense. Like the jokes are sad. Like the whole play is sad. You're not supposed to be like laughing uproariously at that play. And it was interesting because like I went to take a leak during intermission, and hearing people talk about it was kind of disappointing to me, because they were all saying like, I'm not sure what it's about, and I think it's this, I think it's that. And it was so clear that they weren't even watching, because I think what Waiting for Godot is about is pretty clear. Like what he's trying to say is pretty clear, and its allegory is very broad. And the fact that this quote unquote sophisticated audience really didn't understand what I think is actually a pretty simple play. I don't know, just as an artist, it felt disappointing, I guess. I don't know.
For me, the problem with Beckett in toto, and if you've ever, you said you haven't read Malloy or Malone, is it Malone and Malloy dies? I think it's Malloy and Malone dies, and another one. He has a very he's not broad. He's my wife has said that, for example, she's read all the novels of Herman Hesse, and Deeming is one of the novels about a guy. Who's a coming of age novel, and he wrote about 5 or 6 novels almost exactly like that before, and Deeming's the best. Or Franz Kafka, all he writes about is the outsider who suffers. To me, and I'll give you an example of what's considered low culture that I think is a lot better than people give it credit for, is Gilligan's Island. To me, Gilligan's Island is the perfect American complement to Beckett, except it had 70 or whatever episodes, and you deal with the characters. You get to know the 7 main characters. Now, I don't buy Sherwood Schwartz's crap, if you've ever read about it, that it's a meaningful critique on American consumerism or the caste system. But if you look at it from a Beckett-like point of view, why the fuck don't they kill Gilligan? This is the way to ensure that they get off the island. Gilligan fucks up everything. A plane crashes there. The professor can fix the plane. Gilligan fucks it up. A raft comes, or a handful of guest stars come with their private yachts or something, and Gilligan fucks it up. Just kill Gilligan. That's what they should have called it. Kill Gilligan. But the thing is, because it never had one of these endings, where everyone comes together and they're rescued, and you can ignore the Harlem Globetrotters and the other TV movies they did 15, 20 years later. It has that perfect kind of circularity that, or like, I was just watching a video. You're probably young enough to remember, well, maybe not the original, Land of the Lost. Do you know what the Land of the Lost is? A Saturday morning.
I know what it is. I don't think I've ever seen.
Yeah,
They did a
that's
remake
another,
on it.
and I'm going to probably do a show, probably get someone that, to me, that's one of the greatest. That's probably one of the greatest Saturday morning shows ever on television. And this came from Sid and Marty Krofft, who did things like Sigmund and the Sea Monsters and H.R. Puff and stuff. But those are 2 examples, Land of the Lost and Gilligan's Island, I think, that are very underrated pop cultural things that they didn't intend to have depth, but if you watch some of them, especially Land of the Lost, has some really deep philosophical ideas in it about the past and the future, time travel. There's one scene that I remember as a kid where they're high on a mountain, and it turns out they're in a pocket universe because they can look far in their binoculars about 2 miles off, and they can see the backs of their heads. And so these are these things that in the mid 1970s, 7, 8, 9-year-old kids were getting this. But they were also getting the entertainment because they cared about the characters. There was character development, the 3 main characters in Land of the Lost, the 7 characters in Gilligan's Island. And when you have character, you can jam in whatever the fuck shit you want there because you've got the people's attention. Whether it's just a silly kind of thing of the debate, who'd you rather fuck, Ginger or Marianne, it draws someone in with that kind of thing, even if it's a minor display of character.
Yeah, I think you have a really strong point, especially about low culture. The one question I'd ask, though, is like, I kind of think a lot of those things do intend to have depth. Like, I think Transformers, Michael Bay's Transformers movies are a really good example of, like, I should do a video on those at some point because I actually think that they're extraordinarily rich. And
let
so.
me tell you, since you mentioned that, look back about 10 interviews ago, I interviewed a guy named the Feral Historian. If you watch his stuff and watch some of his videos, I think you'll find yourself in sync with 95% of them because what he does is he analyzes a lot of these forgotten, like he did one on a recent film called The Silo, or a TV show called The Silo. It's a sci-fi thing set in a nuclear silo after the apocalypse or something. I'd never heard of it, but I think you'd look up the Feral Historian video and
Okay.
look at his stuff. But anyway, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, but it's interesting. Like another really good example is, have you seen the Kubrick movie Spartacus? It's
Yeah.
like barely a Kubrick movie. Yeah.
Yeah.
What's interesting about that movie is it's so clearly like a communist allegory, right? Like Trumbo was a Marxist, and if you watch the film, like you can see very clearly that he's like advocating for Marxism, which I'm not a fan of Marxism, but it's interesting that, like, to me, that's very intentionally put in there. Like he wrote this movie that's an inaccurate representation of the Spartacist rebellion, right? Like that's not what happened, and it's not history, but he uses this popular genre to sort of shoehorn in some political ideas that he was interested in addressing, so I think a lot of times in popular art, it's very intentional that people are trying to talk about big questions. A really good example of this, have you ever seen Jerry Seinfeld's Bee movie?
Beat, Beat?
Bee movie?
V, like
Bee, no, like Bumblebee.
Oh, okay.
Bee.
No.
So Jerry Seinfeld, I think, was like the producer, and I think he wrote it and starred in it. He may not have written it, but
Was this pre-Seinfeld, the sitcom?
No, it's post. It's
Okay.
like came out like between 5 and 10 years ago.
Mm.
But what's interesting about it is it's also clearly a political allegory, and it's like championing this like kind of neoliberal order. But it's very interesting because they're like revolutionaries. It's kind of like addressing questions about Marxism or about sort of like a right wing worldview, and it sort of ends on like like neoliberalism is the best way to go. And again, I don't necessarily agree with the politics, but it's fascinating because it's an incredibly rich treatment of those questions in a seemingly innocuous kids movie. And so I do think some of the most interesting popular and the stuff that really catches on, I think character is part of it, but I also think that there's something, I think that's when someone puts enough richness in a text, whether it's a film or a poem or whatever, that kind of like articulates the zeitgeist, or may even shift it. I think that's sort of what makes work immortal. But I don't know. I mean, yeah, like to me, like part of what's interesting about B movie is that it was just that rich, or part of what's interesting about Spartacus, right? Like Spartacus, again, I strongly disagree with politics, but I think part of the reason it's still a classic, and I don't know, Cleopatra from the same era is not, that movie sucks, right? The reason people are still talking about Spartacus is, I think, because it deals with like some really profound questions in really powerful ways, I guess.
Yeah, well, the whole sword and sandal genre is interesting. I mean, one of the movies that is probably not regarded as highly as I should. Well, I'll give you two. In fact, one a sword and sandal, and one a western. And this is by an actor who's been reviled, Charlton Heston, because of his NRA views. The sword and sandal epic, I would say, if you want to see, is El Cid, which is about the mid 13th or 14th century Spanish national hero during the Reconquista. And then regarding the war movie is if you watch Major Dundee, where Richard Harris, coming off his star-making turn in what was the movie? Oh, I forget it, but it's his first American movie with Heston, and it's basically about an abortive mission into Mexico during or after, might be right after the Civil
It's
War.
called Mr. Dundee.
Major Dundee. Major.
Okay, I love Charlton Heston.
Dundee. And then El Cid is CID. CID. Those are two very underrated films. Because a lot of people think that between the Ten Commandments and Ben-Hur, until the time he got his revival with Planet of the Apes, that he wasn't doing anything. But he was doing a lot of these interesting films that, for one reason or another, just haven't stuck in the public zeitgeist. But I mean, I think he's a much better actor than John Wayne, and yet he's sort of lumped in with John Wayne, even though John Wayne would never have done, Soylent Green. I mean,
I wanted to mention, I love Soylent Green.
Yeah.
I think Soylent Green is a great movie, and maybe my view on Heston is, I don't know that much about the NRA. I'm maybe much more pro Second Amendment than you are, only because I feel like I don't like governments. I'm not like a libertarian or anything, but I feel like governments are scary and they lie a lot, and that the Second Amendment is there to like protect us from the government, not so we can hunt or defend ourselves.
Well, I'm pro Second Amendment, but I don't think anyone should have weaponry that they can shoot a 747 out of the sky. That's not what's meant by it.
Well, so to me, I think the weaponry, like the reason, like the Second Amendment reads like a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free people, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, or something like that. Like the well-regulated militia part, like I think there should be a gun, like people should be allowed to own whatever facilitates the formation of a well-regulated militia. The only reason, a lot of militias do bad things, right? But I think that if you look at a force like the Black Panthers, someone can certainly say that they did some bad things, but at the same time, it's like, African Americans in California and everywhere across this country were being, grossly discriminated against, and it's like they, a group of people needed to arm themselves to defend themselves against a tyrannical government. And that, like, for me, I don't know, like, for me, the Second Amendment, I think, is important. But regardless, Heston, Soylent Green, I think, is one of those movies. I think it's way better than Planet of the Apes. Planet of the Apes doesn't resonate for me in the same way, I guess. Like, I don't, it feels very French because it's based on a French novel. And I feel like a lot of, I don't get it.
But the novel is actually a great novel if you get to read it. The twist.
Oh, maybe I should check it out.
The twist at the end of that novel is even better than the Statue of Liberty twist.
Is it? Does he find like a giant croissant or?
No, but I will tell you though, I'm not a big fan of government, but I'm far more scared of corporations that are law, especially global.
Is there a
corporations.
difference at this point?
That's a fair point, but I think there is still, especially at the local levels, you can still have control of stuff. But
I agree.
But once you've gotten the money system in Washington, I mean, what you're only left, the only thing that can contain these global corporations are governments, and this is one of the reasons you need to. I mean, I'm big on ranked choice voting. I think you should have instant runoffs. I think there's a lot of I think good, sensible changes that can be made to the electorate of the election. But I'm firmly believer that the problem isn't the politicians. It's the people who vote. If I said this, I think Democrats have held the body of the country down so the Republicans can rape it for 40 years. And to me, they're both guilty of raping the country. It's just a matter of degree with one of them. And yet the people, they keep voting these clowns in. I said, vote, go look. I actually did a series of 4 or 5 interviews with 2020 third-party candidates. I'm going to look to do that again. Not that it's going to have any effect. But, I mean, people who talk about wasting their votes, you know, bullshit. I voted for Ralph Nader 3-4 times because I thought he was legitimately the best and most honest person running. I'm not saying he was a saint, but he was far better than Al Gore or George W. Bush or any of the other people that when he was running. And yet people won't do that. So you get the public gets what they deserve if you don't have an active and informed public.
Well, I definitely think that I think we need more than two parties. I think I've always almost voted third party because it's been very hard for me to get behind any. Yeah, and it's hard for me to tell which party is worse currently. It's funny because some people have like a clear sense. I think my biggest problem is like which party advocates for war the most. I don't like war, and so like right now. It's and which one advocates for censorship the most. And I think to me the most pernicious influence that's happened in this country, at least this century, is sort of like the neoconservative worldview that starts with Bush, but then I think it's picked up very much by Obama, and it's picked up by sort of like the Biden worldview. And I'm certainly not a Trump, or I disagree really strongly with a lot of what Trump did, or said, I should say. But the one perk of Trump is I think he showed the media for the liars that they are and the propagandists they are, A, and B, he was the most peaceful president since Jimmy Carter. Like those two things I think are like good. As for, he still was not peaceful enough. He's still a war criminal. And they should all be in jail to me. Like every living president should be in. I don't know if Biden has committed war crimes yet. I'm trying to think. I don't know.
He probably
that
did in the Senate, but for voting for I mean, if you voted for
Who did he vote for? Yeah, he should be in jail then. Yeah,
and even the sainted Jimmy Carter asked the people in Indonesia and East Timor about Jimmy Carter and what a humanitarian he was.
Oh, I have no doubt that Carter is not a good. Oh, and speak of Noam Chomsky, so to me, Chomsky, I have a lot of problems with him because I think Chomsky is like way chummier with communism than anybody should be. Like I don't think communism is good, right? Like I don't know why there's like suddenly this resurgence of like let's get rid of.
Here's what I say. I think Marx and Engels gave the best critique of capitalism up to that point, and maybe arguably ever. The problem is they didn't have a workable solution. Communism is against. People will get on me. They'll say there's no human nature. Maybe come back in 10,000 years and humanity will become more angelic of heart, and then maybe you can have your communism. But I don't even know if it would be a good thing then, because you need to have a certain level of competition. There's no such thing as the invisible hand. Every market that there's ever been, there are malefactors that are being puppet masters trying to control things. And with that, and knowing that, that's why I think communism as a whole failed. Dipping into the genocide stuff, that's just a logical outcome of any group that's in power, regardless of the political system that put them there.
Right, and I think so. I don't like the way. To me, communism is kind of like a secular religion, like a messianic religion without a messiah. To use Derrida's language,
Mao, Stalin, they were cults of personality, 100%.
Right. And I also think just like all of our language about freedom and democracy, it's like never really those are like very malleable, meaningless terms. Same thing with communism to me. It's like communism is the excuse that people use to impose some kind of totalitarian regime. Like it's not really like Mao isn't a true Marxist. Like I don't think he gives a shit about the real revolution.
Well, I've said this about Ho Chi Minh. If the Girl Scouts of America had supported him, he would have called himself a Girl Scout. We blew it there with Ho Chi Minh. We could have had Vietnam 20 years if we had just said to the French, "Fuck off, we're taking over, and we're going to let the Vietnamese run it." But then again, There's this is what and people talk about Eisenhower making his famous speech warning about the military-industrial complex. He was the hero of World War II. He was the great general. He was the president. Why didn't he do anything about the military-industrial complex when he was in there? So when people talk about oh, Ike was the last honest president or something, he didn't do fucking shit in 8 years. As far
Yeah,
as
the one, I mean, he did give us the highway system, right?
well, yeah,
But I don't know enough about Eisenhower's administration. It's also funny that Adlai Stevenson got his ass kicked twice. It's kind of amazing, like how they trotted him out again. I think he lost quite badly both times.
yeah.
I may be wrong, but it wasn't close from what maybe I'm wrong. I should probably look that up. Yeah. So I don't like on Chomsky. I do think so. I think he is way too chummy with like Marxists. But I think that I like Marx. I think that his critique is a lot more interesting than the solutions he provides, and I think his critique can be very thoughtful. Especially his propaganda model, I think, is actually really useful, and his way of showing that journalists can actually be operating in good faith and still captured by a system that forces them to behave dishonestly. I think that's a real contribution on Chomsky's part. Like that I do like about him.
Well, I think Chomsky, his stuff with language and the brain is interesting. What happened? One of the things that I think is very mal about Chomsky is he was a precursor of people like Richard Dawkins. These were people who were once scientists who were actually making good contributions. But guess what? We'd rather make $50,000 a pop to do fucking TED Talks and talk about fucking atheism. It's like Dawkins. He came up with the idea of the meme, which is a valuable contribution. The idea of the selfish gene, which is more of a metaphor, but gives lay people an understanding into evolution. But what did he do? He hasn't done anything since then. He gave up his science career because he was able to make wads of money. Chomsky pockets $50,000 to $100,000 every time he goes to a goddamn college. Chomsky is worth probably 20, 30 million from all the fucking talks he's done over the years. Why hasn't he ever put, as far as I know, he's never put his money where his mouth is in talking about things. He's never taken in refugees that he could afford to take in with all of the money that he's had on the lecture circuit for 50 or 60 years. And that plus the genocide denialism and whatnot, I just find him, I think overall he's had a absolutely negative overall effect on American academia.
So it's interesting because I think he actually apologized for the Cambodia stuff. I don't know about and people can make mistakes, right? Like, he wasn't, he wasn't contributing to Pol Pot.
But he still denies the Black Book of Communism has any value. He denies stuff about the stuff that came out from during the Yeltsin era when they opened up the records about the NKVD and the what is it? KGB. How could I forget that? So I mean, I'm not saying he's an evil person. In some way, I think he was trying to do good, but
it's interesting the way I think the right has a valid critique when they say that a lot of these universities are actually captured by people who really are sympathetic to Marxism. Like it was interesting. It's been very interesting to see Wikipedia become, in a lot of ways, apologists for Marxism. And you can't really there are things that you can't say or you'll get booted off. Like, it's interesting, like when someone puts the word cultural Marxism in Wikipedia, it starts out by saying it's an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, which is crazy to me, right? Like the idea that because there is 100%, there are people who are legit anti-Semites who are saying like the Jews are trying to make us all Marxists or whatever, right? And that's true, but I think that there are a lot of thoughtful critics, like whether you agree with them or not, who are very far from prejudiced, and who certainly are not saying that this is Jewish people doing it or whatever, but they're talking about it like an ideology that's captured certain elements of culture that like when you look in Teen Vogue magazine and say and read an article in Teen Vogue that says if we want to get rid of racism, we need to abolish private property. Like, to me, it's like, well, that sounds weird that it's in Teen Vogue. That sounds like propaganda. Do you know what I mean? Like I don't think we need to abolish private property. And I think I know where you're coming from. You know, like anybody who's read Marx knows where you're coming from. And I think that it's valid to critique that. And yet on Wikipedia, and I think in a lot of the academy, there's just this uncritical appraisal of the Soviet, or an appraisal of the Soviet era and of Mao that's far less critical than it should be. I mean, and you know, like this idea that Mao, you know, like this pushing away responsibility for stuff like the Great Leap Forward, you know, and saying that it's not really a genocide or what. I think, and maybe it's not technically, but it's like, I think there are a lot of apologists for Mao and for maybe not Stalin, but for the Khrushchev era, or for, you know, in a way that's ugly and alarming.
Wikipedia is just the largest links farm on the internet. I mean, that's basically what it's become, and it was destined to become that way because you can't have anything intellectual when you have anonymous people who clearly, most of them can't even fucking use vocabulary or grammar well. They don't. I mean, there are so many poorly. They don't even know how the difference between using a comma and a semicolon. So. But anyway, let's wrap up, and let me just ask you about then. What is your ultimate goal then with the channel? You said about making films eventually, but is your hope to be able to get into that range where you can make, you know, at least a good portion of your living, and then, you know, using that to maybe fund a film or two?
Well, I mean, maybe, yeah. I mean, I made a film a couple years ago, and I'm hoping, you know, like we're you know, I'm working with some people putting some stuff together for the next film, so hopefully that'll happen, you know, God willing. And it's sort of like not connected, the two, but you know, like a lot of actors, etc., like they have a YouTube channel or an Instagram presence or whatever, and it would be nice if I could monetize, you know, and if I could put videos out when I feel like it. About different stuff. I'm trying to think of the next video to do. I'm not sure yet. I probably need to change.
Let me just ask you. I think I saw one of your early videos where you explained what the last sitcom meant. It was like an ongoing thing. Well, explain the title so people.
Well,
no.
So the last sitcom was actually initially like this idea of like this gigantic multimedia narrative, which I'm going to turn into a film. So I don't want to say too much about it, but there's also. I mean, a Christian waits for the eschaton, right? Like you know, Jews, Christians, and Muslims hope for the eschaton, and you know, so that means like the whole cosmic story is in fact a comedy, not a tragedy. You know, like in the Book of Revelation, Christ says, "Behold, I am making all things new."
Well, that's why Dante called his thing the comedy, not the divine comedy, just the comedy was originally.
And there's, hold on one second. I'm going to show you. There's this beautiful quote from Walter Benjamin, who I did a video on. But you know, Benjamin was a Marxist, but he's someone that I find wonderful and who really haunts me. And I wanted to read this quote. It's just a couple of paragraphs. But so Benjamin wrote this beautiful text called Theses on the Philosophy of History. And this was, from what I understand, so Benjamin was a Jewish man, and he was being hunted by the Marxists, and he was running away. And I think he was near Spain at this point, and he realized like he wasn't going to be able to get out. And so he took his own life.
Was he hunted by the Marxists or the Nazis?
No, by the Nazis, not by the Marxists.
You said Marxist, that's why.
Oh, sorry, no. Benjamin was a Marxist that was being hunted by the
Nazis. That's why I thought.
Right. So for being Jewish and be a Marxist, he was not didn't make a lot of friends in Hitler's Germany, as you would imagine. So he took his own life. But before he did, he wrote this extraordinary text that feels almost mystical, even though he's he's a Marxist, so he's not religious in this sense. But these two paragraphs, to me, I think sort of articulate. I hope it gives a hint as to what my channel means without me saying explicitly. But so he writes, historicism contents itself with establishing a causal connection between various moments in history. But no fact that is a cause is for that very reason historical. It became historical posthumously, as it were. though events may be separated from it by thousands of years. A historian who takes this as his point of departure stops telling the sequence of events like the beads of a rosary. Instead, he grasps the constellation which his own era has formed with a definite earlier one. Thus, he establishes a conception of the present as the time of the now, which is shot through with chips of messianic time. The soothsayers who found out from time what it had in store certainly did not experience time as either homogeneous or empty. Anyone who keeps this in mind will perhaps get an idea of how past times were experienced in remembrance, namely in just the same way. We know that the Jews were prohibited from investigating the future. The Torah and the prayers instruct them in remembrance, however. This stripped the future of its magic, to which all those succumb who turn to the soothsayers for enlightenment. This does not imply, however, that for the Jews the future turned into homogeneous, empty time. For every second of time was the straight gate through which the Messiah might enter. And so that's like the last words of Thesis on the Philosophy of History. And yeah, there's this I think there's this remarkable hope in my faith and in the Abrahamic religions of all things being made new, right? And like the last words of the book of Revelation are come quickly, Lord Jesus. And I think that hope is way beyond any sort of like scientific hope or even like a historical hope in the normal sense. And I think whether we know it or not, that's something that we're all sort of looking for. And so, yeah, my channel my goal in part is just to help people, to give people a language, symbolic language to be able to articulate that and to be able to recognize it for themselves. And so I hope that answers your question, as abstract and perhaps pretentious as that might have sounded.
No, I was actually talking with a friend a couple of days ago about free will and determinism. I'm a free will advocate. He was more of a determinist. But anyway, I will link to the website, or rather the channel below this video. So I want to thank you, Jacob, for spending over 2 hours talking about your channel, and hopefully you'll get some good growth and viewership.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate it, and you too. I think you have a great channel, and I look forward to perhaps talking again sometime.